temperature in the operations room at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia registered barely above freezing despite the wood-burning stoves that struggled to heat the concrete bunker. A physical reminder of the catastrophic conditions facing German forces hundreds of kilometers to the east, where army group centers advanced toward Moscow had stalled in temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius, and where Wehrmacht soldiers were dying not just from Soviet counterattacks, but from cold that their summer uniforms and inadequate winter equipment could not protect against. It was mid-December 1941, and Adolf Hitler stood before the situation maps with Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch and General Franz Halder reading meteorological reports that predicted the brutal winter conditions would continue for months rather than weeks, that there would be no early thaw that might restore German operational mobility, and that the Soviet forces launching counteroffensives against overstretched German positions showed no signs of the collapse that Hitler's ideology had insisted must follow the catastrophic losses the Red Army had suffered since June. In that moment, though Hitler would never explicitly acknowledge it and would continue issuing orders based on assumptions that contradicted meteorological reality, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the campaign. The recognition that Soviet winter would not break as German planning had assumed, that the campaign could not be concluded before spring, and that the entire strategic conception of Operation Barbarossa as a quick, decisive victory achieved before winter had failed, in ways that would force Germany into exactly the kind of prolonged multi-front war that the Führer's strategy had been designed to avoid. Hitler's realization that the Soviet winter would not break emerged gradually through December 1941 and into early 1942, shaped by the accumulation of reports documenting conditions that contradicted everything German planning had assumed about the campaign's timeline and about Soviet capabilities to resist through winter months. The fundamental assumption underlying Barbarossa planning had been that German forces would destroy the Red Army's main forces in border battles during the summer, would advance to the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line before winter, and would occupy positions from which any remaining Soviet resistance could be contained without requiring major combat operations during winter months when weather conditions made mobile warfare difficult or impossible. This assumption had shaped logistics planning, equipment procurement, and operational timetables in ways that made German forces catastrophically unprepared for the reality they faced in December 1941. The meteorological reports arriving at Wehrmacht headquarters throughout late November and early December painted a picture of winter conditions that were both more severe than German planning had anticipated and more prolonged than the optimistic assumptions about early thaw that had shaped logistics decisions. Temperatures were dropping to levels that froze lubricants in tanks and vehicles, that made weapons malfunction, that caused frostbite in soldiers who lacked adequate winter clothing and shelter. Snow accumulation was making roads impassable and limiting off-road mobility that German armored doctrine depended upon. Most crucially for Hitler's strategic thinking, the forecasts showed no indication that these conditions would moderate significantly before March or April, meaning that German forces would have to endure 3 to 4 months of winter conditions while occupying extended positions without the winter equipment, shelter, or supplies that such prolonged operations required. The recognition of winter's duration and severity came simultaneously with realization that Soviet forces were not collapsing under the combined pressures of catastrophic summer losses and winter conditions, but were instead launching coordinated counteroffensives that threatened to encircle and destroy substantial German formations. General Georgy Zhukov's counteroffensive before Moscow, launched on December 5th, had achieved local breakthroughs that raised the possibility of more significant encirclements if German forces could not establish stable defensive positions. Soviet forces that German intelligence had written off as destroyed or too weakened to conduct offensive operations were appearing in front of German positions in numbers that suggested the Red Army retained substantial reserves and mobilization capacity that Barbarossa planning had dramatically underestimated. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center and responsible for the Moscow operation, sent increasingly desperate reports describing the twin catastrophes of winter conditions and Soviet counteroffensives, creating situations that German forces could not address with available resources. His soldiers were dying of exposure in positions they could not properly fortify because the ground was frozen too hard to dig, were abandoning equipment that could not function in extreme cold, and were attempting to defend extended lines against Soviet attacks while lacking the mobility necessary for the kind of flexible defense that Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized. Von Bock's requests for authorization to conduct tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions were initially rejected by Hitler, who insisted that every position must be held regardless of tactical situation. The pattern of Hitler's responses to the winter crisis throughout December revealed his psychological struggle to accept that fundamental assumptions about the campaign had been wrong. His initial reaction was to blame commanders for insufficient determination, to insist that soldiers' will and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages like inadequate winter clothing and frozen equipment, and to frame the crisis as a test of German character rather than as a failure of strategic planning and logistics. The now famous Stand Fast orders issued in mid-December, forbidding retreats and demanding that positions be held regardless of tactical situation, reflected Hitler's conviction that retreat in winter conditions might turn into rout, comparable to Napoleon's 1812 retreat from Moscow. This comparison to Napoleon revealed both Hitler's historical consciousness and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation German forces actually faced. Yes, retreating in winter conditions carried risks of disorder and catastrophic losses. But holding extended positions without adequate supplies, winter equipment, or reserves to respond to Soviet attacks also carried enormous risks, and the choice was not between retreat and secure defense, but between different types of potential catastrophe. Hitler's emphasis on holding positions reflected partly genuine tactical concern about winter retreats, but more fundamentally reflected psychological inability to authorize withdrawals that would symbolize the campaign's failure to achieve objectives before winter. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff and responsible for operational planning, understood by early December that the campaign had failed to achieve its fundamental objective of destroying Soviet military capability before winter. The intelligence reaching OKH documented that Soviet forces retained substantial combat power despite catastrophic losses, that Soviet industry was producing weapons in quantities that suggested mobilization capacity exceeding German estimates, and that Soviet willingness to accept casualties and to continue fighting despite defeats that would have broken other armies meant that the Red Army could not be defeated through the kind of decisive border battles that Barbarossa planning had emphasized. Halder's attempts to explain these realities to Hitler and to argue for strategic adjustments that acknowledge the campaign's prolongation beyond winter were complicated by the command structure that gave Hitler ultimate authority, and by the Führer's increasing unwillingness to accept assessments that contradicted his ideological convictions. Hitler's racial theories taught that Slavic peoples were inferior and that Soviet communism was a brittle system that would shatter under sustained pressure. The reality that Soviet forces were not shattering, that they were conducting sophisticated counteroffensives in conditions that paralyzed German operations, and that Soviet society was mobilizing effectively for total war. All of this contradicted ideological certainties that Hitler could not abandon without undermining his entire worldview. The winter crisis of December 1941 thus represented not just military challenge, but ideological crisis for Hitler, though he would never acknowledge it in those terms. His ideology had predicted that Slavic armies would collapse, that communist political systems would fragment under pressure, that racially inferior peoples could not sustain the kind of total war that required sophisticated industrial mobilization and popular commitment. The evidence from the Eastern Front contradicted each of these predictions. But acknowledging that the predictions were wrong would require admitting that the racial theories justifying the entire Nazi project were false. Hitler could not make this admission psychologically or politically, so instead he rationalized the failures through blaming commanders, through emphasizing exceptional circumstances like unexpectedly severe winter, and through insisting that renewed offensives in spring would achieve the decisive results that summer and fall campaigns had failed to deliver. The logistics reports arriving at Wehrmacht headquarters throughout December documented the catastrophic inadequacy of German preparations for winter campaign. The decision not to prepare or distribute winter clothing for the army had been based on assumption that campaign would be concluded before severe winter conditions developed, that the few winter items that might be needed could be procured from occupied territories, and that emphasis on offensive equipment and supplies was more important than defensive preparations for contingencies that planning assumed would not occur. This decision, which had seemed rational given timeline assumptions embedded in Barbarossa planning, now revealed itself as catastrophic miscalculation that was killing German soldiers through exposure, and that was rendering substantial portions of German equipment inoperative due to cold. The improvisation attempts to address winter equipment shortages revealed the scope of the planning failure. Appeals to the German population to donate winter clothing produced some material but could not address the systematic lack of proper military winter equipment. Attempts to procure winter clothing from occupied territories encountered both insufficient supply and distribution problems created by the extended supply lines and primitive Soviet infrastructure. Most fundamentally, the time required to manufacture and distribute proper winter equipment meant that even if production began immediately, German forces would endure most of the winter without adequate protection from conditions that were killing hundreds of soldiers daily. The Soviet winter offensive's success in December further complicated German strategic situation by forcing German forces to conduct active defensive operations in conditions that paralyzed mobility and that made the kind of flexible response Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized nearly impossible. Soviet forces equipped with winter clothing and with equipment designed to function in extreme cold could maneuver and attack, while German forces struggled simply to maintain positions. The winter that German planning had assumed would immobilize both sides equally was instead providing Soviet forces with temporary operational advantage that they were exploiting through coordinated offensives aimed at destroying German formations or forcing chaotic retreats. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief military adjutant and a reliable sycophant who typically reinforced rather than questioned the Führer's judgments, found himself unable to deny the evidence from the Eastern Front that winter conditions were catastrophically worse than planning had assumed, and that Soviet forces were demonstrating capabilities that contradicted German racial theories. Keitel's briefings to Hitler throughout December attempted to frame the situation in ways that minimized implications of planning failures, while acknowledging tactical realities that could not be ignored. But even Keitel could not entirely obscure the fundamental reality that the campaign had not achieved its objectives and that winter was demonstrating Soviet resilience rather than collapsing Soviet resistance as ideology had predicted. The comparison between German expectations and Soviet realities revealed systematic intelligence failures that had shaped Barbarossa planning. German intelligence had underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, particularly the production of tanks and aircraft. They had failed to identify the industrial relocations that moved Soviet factories beyond German reach, creating production capability that would sustain Soviet military operations despite loss of significant industrial territory in western USSR. They had misunderstood Soviet mobilization potential, assuming that the catastrophic casualties inflicted in summer and fall campaigns had exhausted Soviet manpower reserves, when in fact the USSR could mobilize millions of additional soldiers. Most fundamentally, they had failed to understand that totalitarian political systems, while repressive and brutal, could also be extremely effective at mobilizing populations for total war in ways that democratic societies might struggle to match. These intelligence failures were rooted partly in inadequate information collection, but more fundamentally in ideological filters that prevented accurate assessment of information that was available. When intelligence suggested Soviet capabilities exceeded German assumptions, the information was dismissed as enemy disinformation or was explained away through rationalizations that preserved ideological convictions. The result was that Barbarossa planning was based on assumptions about Soviet weakness that had more to do with what German ideology required to be true than with what evidence actually demonstrated. And the winter of 1941-42 was revealing the costs of this ideologically driven intelligence failure. Hitler's personal response to the winter crisis mixed several psychological patterns that would characterize his command decisions throughout the remainder of the war. He blamed subordinate commanders for failures that stemmed from his own strategic decisions and planning assumptions. He insisted that will and determination could overcome material disadvantages and operational constraints. He refused to authorize the kind of strategic adjustments that realistic assessment of the situation suggested were necessary. And he focused obsessively on tactical details while avoiding confrontation with strategic realities that contradicted his ideological framework. The relief and dismissal of senior commanders throughout December and January reflected these patterns. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch was relieved as Commander-in-Chief of the army, with Hitler assuming direct command himself. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved from Army Group Center Command. General Guderian was dismissed from command of 2nd Panzer Army after advocating for tactical withdrawals. These dismissals sent clear message to remaining commanders that questioning Hitler's judgments or advocating for operational approaches that contradicted his directives would result in career destruction, creating command climate where professional military advice was subordinated to ideological and political considerations. The broader strategic implications of Winter's refusal to break extended far beyond the immediate crisis on the Eastern Front. The prolongation of the campaign into 1942 meant that Germany would be committed to multi-front war that Hitler's strategy had been designed to avoid. Resources that might have been concentrated against Britain or secured for potential conflict with the United States were being consumed in ongoing Eastern Front operations. The assumption that quick victory in the East would allow Germany to turn full attention to other theaters was revealed as fantasy. And the reality was that Germany would be fighting major campaigns in East and elsewhere simultaneously, while facing enemies whose combined resources exceeded German capacity. The decision about what to do when spring arrived and winter conditions moderated became focus of strategic planning during the winter months. Hitler was determined that 1942's summer offensive would achieve the decisive results that 1941 operations had failed to deliver, that renewed attacks would destroy remaining Soviet military capability and would secure the oil resources of the Caucasus that Germany desperately needed. But this determination was based on assumptions similar to those that had shaped Barbarossa planning, that Soviet resistance was near breaking point, that one more major offensive would achieve collapse, that German operational excellence could overcome the material and numerical advantages that Soviet forces possessed. General Holder and other professional military officers understood that 1942 offensive, while potentially achieving significant territorial gains, was unlikely to force Soviet surrender unless it somehow destroyed Soviet will to resist, or unless it captured resources that Soviet war effort could not survive losing. But they also understood that expressing these doubts to Hitler was dangerous and potentially futile, that the Führer had committed psychologically and ideologically to achieving decisive victory in the East, and that arguments based on material analysis would be dismissed as defeatism if they contradicted what Hitler's ideology insisted must be possible. The winter that would not break thus became symbol and reality of Barbarossa's failure, of the gap between ideologically driven planning assumptions and operational realities, and of the fundamental strategic miscalculation that had led Germany into prolonged war of attrition against an enemy with greater population, greater industrial potential, and sufficient ideological commitment to sustain resistance despite catastrophic casualties. Hitler's realization that Soviet winter would not break was realization that the campaign could not be concluded quickly, that the assumptions underlying Barbarossa had been wrong, and that Germany faced exactly the kind of prolonged multi-front conflict that strategic planning was supposed to prevent. But this realization, even if Hitler had acknowledged it explicitly rather than rationalizing it away, came too late to alter fundamental strategic trajectory. Germany was committed to the Eastern Front, could not withdraw without surrendering all territorial gains and facing Soviet counteroffensives that might drive into German-held territory, and lacked political framework for negotiated settlement that might have extracted Germany from the conflict. The war would continue, the winter would eventually give way to spring and renewed offensives, but the illusion that quick decisive victory was achievable had been shattered by the winter of 1941–42, even if Hitler could not admit that the shattering had occurred. When Hitler realized the Soviet winter would not break, he was confronting evidence that his fundamental assumptions about the campaign had been wrong, that Soviet resistance was far more resilient than ideology predicted, that material factors mattered more than racial theories acknowledged, and that German strategic position was deteriorating in ways that would ultimately prove fatal.